Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Massive overreach appears to be the order of the day. With President Biden's Hail Mary attempt to enforce vaccinations, will the pendulum ever be able to swing back the other way? Or will further machinations in the education system mean that the ideas of liberty and real individual justice be deemed little more than an historical anomaly? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be dissecting why the Biden administration keeps ducking responsibility for Afghanistan, how academic authoritarianism can be beaten back to the dark ages. Just what does Joe Biden plan to do about these tempestuous Republican governors? I just want to take a moment to send a warm hello to our listeners on KSRM out of Kenai, Alaska, on AM 920 and FM 92.5. Great to have you with us. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get this Liberty train rolling. In the wake of the deaths of 13 military personnel, President Biden took to the stage to vow retaliation. A few days later, we hear that a car containing a terrorist and a large amount of explosives was thwarted by a drone, seemingly a victory for the president and a fulfillment of his promise not to be weak. But that whole narrative appears to have unraveled as news outlets did some rare due diligence and discovered that the target appears to be an NGO worker who helped the U.S., and that the containers of explosives were in fact water being taken to a family who didn't have access to a fresh supply. Now, will the administration admit such a mistake that resulted in the deaths of innocent children in the blast? And how can the American public trust anything that comes out of the White House? Well, to help us find the answer to these is author, retired Air Force pilot, and former Deputy Undersecretary for Defense Controller, Dave Patterson. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me on.
It's really always a pleasure. Now, Dave, it looks like the Biden administration bombed a civilian, one of the good guys, and killed other innocents in the process, and claimed this as a win against a terror attack. How can we trust these folks anymore?
Well, the simple answer is you can't. Developing trust means that you tell people what you've done well, and also you let them know what you've done poorly and what you're going to do to remedy that. What this administration is capable of is, on the first, they lie, and on the second, they're simply incapable of doing that. So what you have is a very stark contrast here. Incompetence rolls downhill. When you had Trump going after Soleimani, they not only tracked the fellow from Iran to Syria and back to Iraq, but had very definite capability to identify him specifically, took him out without collateral damage. On the other hand, you have the Biden administration who had to show strength, picked out any target at random, and then unfortunately killed people that we should not have engaged at all.
In any other words, that would be called a murder, but not in government circles, apparently. Now, what about these mixed stories coming out from the independent rescue groups that are on the ground in Afghanistan? That the State Department is more of a hindrance than a help in getting these evacuees out, and this is including Americans. What's happening with that?
Well, I think that you can take the reports that the State Department is a hindrance, and you can believe that. The State Department is a bureaucracy. They establish a process of doing things from which they will not deviate, regardless of the circumstances on the ground. They're inflexible, and as I like to say it, they have a group of folks who are fighting each other for taking the Alger Hiss chair of fine diplomacy.
All right, now Joe Biden came into office on a wave of trust. The media applauded that we would have honesty and openness from a government, which was supposed to be in direct contrast to Donald Trump, who, I don't know if anybody watched the news for the last 4 years, but he seemed pretty open to me, always ready to deal with questions from reporters, even impromptu ones on his way to and from helicopters. Now, hopes for openness for Joe Biden are clearly dead in the water. There's no unscripted questions or no pre-approved questions and certainly no impromptu addresses. But what of the honesty? Now, when does it become acceptable for the media to call a liar a liar? And what recourse is there to protect the public from government lies and spin?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to realize about the media is that you're observing, I think, buyer's remorse. They now find that the person that they were so gleeful in putting into office is incapable of holding that office or saying anything in a cogent way. And what we have is a fourth estate that has become a fifth column in this nation. And consequently, there's very little trust either of the media or of the administration that they so admire.
And no recourse for the public, I presume.
And no recourse for the public except programs like Liberty Nation and Telling the Truth.
Now, Dave, it seems to me that Afghanistan has become an albatross around the administration's collective neck. And this recent move on vaccine mandates, although creating an uproar, seems to have been a very useful distraction against the foreign policy blunder of such epic magnitude in Afghanistan. Now, you just said that the fourth estate has become a fifth column. So, in your opinion, are they actively helping to bury the bad news before it buries the presidency?
I believe they are. And the other thing I think you have to realize is that as crises happen sequentially, each crisis takes the views of the people away from the previous one. This is not a question of one albatross. Every crisis is an albatross around this administration's neck because they do things so poorly and they're so incompetent at the very top.
So a flock of albatrosses, we might say. Now, from a strategic point of view, how does the administration work back from this? And will heads have to roll? And if so, whose?
I don't think this administration has any appetite for firing anyone for any level of incompetence. I don't think they recognize incompetence when it happens and when they actually see it. What will have to happen, and what happens in this nation every 2 and 4 years, is this crowd needs to be removed from office. First, in the 22 election, to make sure that you have a opposition that's now allowing nothing to happen that isn't in the benefit of the American people. And I think that's the only way a democracy is able to rid itself of this kind of foolishness at the top.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Always good to be with you.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the massive DOJ overreach in our special Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with James Fight to see what's happening with the Republican governor pushback against Biden's vaccine mandates. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The pushback appears to have just begun, but it's not directly aimed at Joe Biden's vaccine mandates. Rather, it is perceived overstepping of the boundaries between federal and states' rights. Now, recent comments suggest that the president is getting ready to steamroll the governors who stand in his way, and the governors aren't happy. To delve into the ramifications, the possibilities, and the legality of all this, we're joined by Liberty Nation's editor-at-large, Jim Fight. Welcome aboard, Jim.
Thanks, Mark.
So, Jim, Biden says that state governors had better get out of the way. Two parts to my first question here. Does he have the legal footing to push them out of the way? And what is the reaction of those governors so far?
To address the legal footing, kind of. It's very situational. So I'll tell you a little story. Back when Thomas Jefferson was president and James Madison was Secretary of State, Aaron Burr, everybody knows the famous story about Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Well, that ruined Burr's political career. And so apparently he came up with this plan to raise an army and either set up his own dynasty in the Louisiana Territory, which had just been acquired by the U.S., or to basically conquer Mexico. So, and Thomas Jefferson wanted to stop him, as you might imagine. And so he actually wrote to Secretary of State James Madison and said, hey, look, does the Constitution give me the power to raise an army and go after this guy. Paraphrasing, of course. I haven't read the letter, but and you may understand James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. These are two of the men who wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So you can imagine they took it very seriously. And Madison said, no, that's not within your power as president. And that's what brought about the Insurrection Act of 1807. That was Congress passed that law. Jefferson signed it into law. And that's what gives the president the power to stop an insurrection or a violent rebellion by basically taking over the state, sending in the military against the governor's wishes. And I told that little story to set up why this was originally created to begin with. Thomas Jefferson wanted to stop Aaron Burr from setting up his own little kingdom and being a problem for everyone. But that law has changed numerous times throughout history. Abraham Lincoln had it amended to justify the Civil War. Shortly after, it was amended again to enforce Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment specifically. So we've seen it invoked and used when violent insurrection may have kind of been a stretch. It has been used to suppress riots, but it was also used to enforce desegregation, which ethically speaking, I'm not saying that was a problem, but legally the justification may have been a little shaky. But what it comes right down to is, any government actor has legal constitutional authority, but they also have what I call practical authority, which is to say they can pretty much do whatever they want until somebody stops them.
Fair enough. So what is the reaction of the governors? I mean, I believe 27 out of 30 Republican governors against the vaccine mandate so far are pushing back on this. So what can they do about it, and will their actions be challenged?
Yeah, they're definitely not happy. It was, let's see here, Mark Gordon, the governor of Wyoming, said that this is a new rule that has no place in America. The Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, said that that's outside the role of the president to dictate the whole, mandating that any private business with more than 100 employees either enforce the employees getting the vaccine or fire them. So we are seeing a lot of pushback. And in a previous article, I had mentioned that there are, 30 of the 50 states are in Republican control. So ultimately, what's Biden going to do? Send 30 regiments of the military into 30 different states to lock it down? I mean, look, I certainly hope that doesn't happen.
It is somewhat beyond the realms of possibility, though.
It would be insane. I'm not saying it would never happen, but
all right, so
it's certainly insane.
As a non-American, one of the most attractive things for me about the United States is the idea that states can write their own rules. So if you think a state has gone too far, you're unhappy with the way the state is going, as obviously a lot of people in the very blue states are at the moment, with them all moving down to Texas and Florida. But you have that, if you don't believe that the state is representative of your beliefs or your ideals or your values, most specifically, then you can just move to another state and you're still an American. Now, it seems to me that Biden's trying to trample this. And isn't that the purview of a monarch rather than a president?
Oh, well, absolutely. And again, I'll go back to the history of the Republic. We got to keep in mind, originally, the president was never intended to have anywhere near the power that we grant the president now. Or perhaps I should say that we allow the president to take. And yes, if that's one of the beautiful things about the United States of America, is that it is a union of otherwise sovereign states, or at least it was supposed to be. And if you didn't like something in California, you could move to Texas. If you didn't like something in Texas, you could move to New York, whatever. Of course, the farther you have to move, the greater the expense and the more the difficulty, but it's not like revoking your citizenship, going to another country. It's literally just packing up and moving.
Let's talk practicality for a moment. With OSHA, the Health and Safety Administration, Biden could actually get these mandates passed, right? Or is it more likely that he's going to end up with a watered down version once OSHA finishes the drafting of the specific rules?
Well, OSHA is an executive department, but it was also created by an act of Congress. So Does OSHA have the authority to make these rules? Well, yeah, Congress said so, and thus far the courts haven't ruled otherwise. It's not a matter of like OSHA is going to shut anybody down or go in there and, hold you down and make you take a vaccine or anything. But they can certainly fine a company out of existence if it refuses to comply. Well, here's what I think will happen. I think OSHA will give Biden as close to what he wants as they feel is practically enforceable. Now, what that will end up being, who knows? But the result, whether or not it actually is allowed to be put into effect or not, is all going to depend on how the courts deal with these 27 lawsuits.
All right. Now, Jim, it's clear from polling that some folks in America think that Biden is right, and he's right to try and enforce these mandates, as is their right to think so. But the Democrats, they are in a precarious position with these razor-thin majorities in both the House and the Senate. So what happens in 2022 to the mandates if or when they lose the majorities, which is, historically speaking, quite likely?
Well, anything done by presidential executive order isn't necessarily going to be affected by a change in control of Congress immediately. Having said that, if the Democrats lose majority in both houses and the Republicans gain enough control of the Senate, you could very well see federal laws passed to protect states' rights.
Just a quick follow-up on that. So if the Democrats lost both majorities and the new Congresses that would be, for example, Republican controlled, and they drafted policies and passed policies that would either limit or pull back on these mandates, Biden would still have to sign those. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, he would have to sign them, or we would have to get what's called a veto-proof majority.
Sure. All right. So this could be Joe Biden's opportunity to finally display the unity promise that he got elected on, right?
Yeah, is that what you think is going to happen, Mark?
Acts that a Republican-led Congress land on his desk. I think that's David all like to see unity in politics, correct?
Yeah. That's what they say.
James,
I suspect that's not how it would go. Sorry.
Awesome. James Fight, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
Coming up soon on the show, we'll be figuring out just how low the Department of Justice will go in achieving its politicized aims. But next up, we're casting a light on the fickle authoritarianism of America's broken education system. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And this week, we offer a special thank you to those of you listening on KBKW 103.5 FM, the talk of Grays Harbor, Washington. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It will come as little surprise that homeschooling in the United States has rocketed over the last several years. Now, part of this is due to the encroachment of the umbrella term critical race theory, and partly because many Americans are beginning to see schools as little more than indoctrination centers. So what does the future hold for education, educators, and most importantly, the kids, who seem to have become the pawns in an ongoing culture war? Here to help us strip away the veneer of scholastic scheming is podcaster and author Jeff Charles. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Jeff, we see the number of homeschoolers going through the roof, and far from being a bunch of white folks in rural areas, as the big box media seem to be portraying, there are huge numbers coming out of the Black community. What are the latest figures on this, Jeff?
Yeah, so when it comes to Black parents homeschooling, between 2019 and May of this year, 2021, the numbers have risen from 1% of Black families to 8%. So a 7-point increase in Black families choosing to homeschool.
That is a huge rise. That's just a ridiculously huge number. Now, tell me, is this really because parents feel that schools are more about indoctrination rather than education? And if so, are their fears well-founded?
You know, it's something a little different. I think that the issue is pretty complex and nuanced. When they've done studies on this of Black parents who do homeschool, the number one reason is the lack of quality education. And since we know that a lot of Black people live in Democratic areas and Democrats don't want parents to be able to choose which schools they send their child to, a lot have decided to homeschool. Another factor that they have cited is racism that their kids tell them that they experience in class. And there's a lot of different stories and different interviews that have been done and numerous studies on that. So it's kind of complex. I mean, but there are some parents also that just aren't satisfied with the whole, with a lot of the woke stuff going on as well. So I think it's a lot of different reasons for a lot of different people. I think the pandemic had a lot to do with this increase.
Yeah, it was the impetus that I think allowed so many families to realize that they could homeschool. It's not something that's beyond the capabilities.
Yes.
And of course, homeschooling is the ultimate reaction to no school choice.
Yeah, I mean, they can force Black parents to send their parents to one school, but they can't force them not to homeschool, at least not yet.
Not yet, and I'm sure we'll come to that later. Now, Kentucky Democrat Representative John Yarmouth, he recently made a few waves by saying that parents don't know what's best for their children. This strikes me as a massive overreach of his position. I mean, is that where we're at now?
Yeah, Mark, we've been here for a while. Yarmouth, he just said the quiet part out loud. This is how the hard left views this thing. They believe that it's why they are willing to teach kids things without their parents knowing, and they'll try to keep parents not involved in the process. So yeah, they do see it that way. They see that your child as a belonging of the state, and for them to mold and shape their opinions in the way that they see fit. This doesn't apply to everybody on the left, but it does apply to people on the hard left. They very much believe this.
Yeah, as the Jesuits used to say, give us the boy and we'll give you the man.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's a way of indoctrinating or instilling a certain mindset in the old generations by taking care of them at the younger levels. Now, let's talk about these educators for a moment. Now, obviously, there are many fantastic educators. I was one myself for many years. But you wrote a piece for Liberty Nation recently about one of these teachers who basically had enough. What's his story?
Yeah, so this is about Peter Bogosian, who has become fairly well known, especially on the right, because he and some other people did a project where they showed how ridiculous the wokeness was going on at these universities. They wrote a series of fake papers with ridiculous subjects, and they actually got accepted to the journals that they submitted them to. So just to show the ridiculousness, he used to teach at Portland University, and he for 10 years, and then he quit because the atmosphere was becoming more and more authoritarian as far as silencing other views. It started to become less about educating people and more about influencing students.
Well, yeah, I think for those of us that have been following the trajectory over the last few years, we're not so surprised about this. We've written on it, we've discussed it it started with the banning of conservative voices on college campuses, which was written off as a right-wing myth at one point. And we correctly predicted that the next step would be the cancelling of all different opinions or viewpoints within regular schools' classrooms. Now that's come to pass, and we were proven right in our very sad predictions there. But what's the next step?
Yeah, I mean, the next step is they're going to continue their indoctrination. I mean, if people like us, of conservatives, and even people on the left who don't want to go this far as the indoctrination and as far as the hard leftist ideology, they're going to push this as far as they can. And we already saw them trying to do it with the critical race theory and a lot of the woke theology that they're infusing into these classrooms. They're going to take this as far as they can, and they're going to spread it to as many different schools as possible.
Do you see a critical race theory as not really a theory in itself, but more a vehicle for ideas that have been bandied around amongst, let's call them the socialist left, for the last 4 or 5 decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a movement. I mean, it is a theory. There is a theory, but there are a lot of different schools of thought within that theory. There are a lot of different ideas that come from it, but it is a movement. And like you said, it is a vehicle through which to influence what's going on in the country. It's not, I wouldn't say that critical race theory is as pervasive as what I call woke theology, because sometimes people get the two mixed up, but there is a lot of overlap, right? It comes from the same source. It comes from the same Marxist source. So there is overlap. And I do think that this is yet just one of several vehicles by which the hard left seeks to infuse their ideology into the classroom and other institutions.
It seems to me sometimes that there's an attempt at creating a culture war by various initiatives that that people on the hard left know that people on even the let's call it the mild conservative right will want to push back on, and then it will create anger, and they'll misrepresent on both sides just to try and foment this this burgeoning culture war. Now, it seems to me that parents are worried about their children. They're not getting so much of an education, but more of a cultural brainwashing. And just these last weeks, we've seen parents stand up in front of school boards detailing books that are in their children's school libraries that are purely pornographic in nature. Now, the excuses that are being given are that, well, the book was simply there by mistake. It was part of a recommended reading list, but it never should have made it to the shelves. Now, I'm hearing case after case that there was a mistake, but these books are on the recommended reading list in the first place. Doesn't this show that it's larger than just a couple of teachers and a board of administrators?
Yeah, I think it is. Now, I did read about one case, and it did sound like they may have, because the book had a similar title to the actual pornographic book. So I think somebody may have just recommended the wrong one on accident. However, this doesn't mean much. That may have been a mistake, but we've been seeing these stories come out, especially in New York, at these prestigious schools that parents pay a lot of money to send their children to, private schools, and they bring in teachers who actually teach about pornography and actually give seminars on pornography, and even having children as young as, third, fourth, and fifth graders learning about sex and other aspects of that. They've tried to infuse that in the education system here in Austin ISD. So it is happening, that they are trying to put stuff in your children's classrooms without you knowing about it. And guess what shed a lot of light on that? The pandemic, because children were learning from home, their parents were more aware of what was going on in the classrooms. And that's why we've seen this backlash that's going on across the country, which frankly is a positive sign.
And Jeff, final question, if I may. What's the future for education in America? It's a big question, right?
It is. It's going to ultimately...
In 3 words or less.
Okay. I don't know if I can say 3 words. I mean, ultimately, it's going to depend on how conservatives react, or how we deal with it. Are we going to push back, or are we going to let it happen? What's been encouraging is seeing this big backlash to a lot of the woke theology that's been taught, people going to their school board meetings. But what I like about it is that they're going beyond just complaining about it. You've got parents running for school boards all across the country. That's power. That's political power, getting involved in your local politics. If you don't like what your school board is doing, then you run somebody against them and you get them out and you get people in who the community actually wants. So if that continues, I think we'll be fine.
Jeff Charles, thank you for finishing on a positive note. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Right after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott DiCossenza. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the fantastic Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DiCossenza Esquire. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks so much, Mark.
It's decided under Merrick Garland to go against the new Texas law on abortions after a heartbeat has been detected, which we've talked about before on this show. So how does the state versus federal mechanics work here?
Well, if a state passes a law or enacts a law or enforces a law that the powers that be, namely Merrick Garland, he is certainly one of the powers that be, decides is unconstitutional, they can sue that state, and basically the Supreme Court is going to be the judge of this. I mean, in a big case like an abortion case, for instance, so it'll start in the lower courts and we'll get a ruling. They may apply for injunctive relief, which is what, of course, the private parties have already done. But that doesn't mean there can't be different arguments made and a different outcome made on behalf of that. And it is appropriate for the federal government to stop states from infringing on the constitutional rights of their citizens. And I think that it would, just because we may disagree with the Biden administration on all manner of things, if we agreed that state X was doing something that was clearly unconstitutional to the detriment of their citizens, we would want the federal government to rush in and assert those rights on behalf of its citizens. So strictly speaking, it's a proper form for the AG to do this, I think.
I'm very glad you put it that way, because that brings me perfectly onto my next question, which might provide a bit of a rubbing against the grain of that. So we've seen President Biden in recent days say that he's going to get those pesky GOP governors out of the way. As a constitutional lawyer, what would you say that the president has in his arsenal? And will it fall to the DOJ to do his work for him?
He can do all sorts of things. The president has a staggering amount of power. Now, whether he's willing to go to the wall to exercise it, and whether how the Republican governors will respond in kind is a bit speculative. But because of the way we structured our society, with so much spending and control coming from the federal government, that when those people who control those levers decide to do something and move them, they can move mountains effectively.
But the spending is controlled by Congress, correct?
Yes.
So
well,
Congress would have to work.
Excuse me, Mark. Spending is authorized by Congress, but you could say that it's in some ways controlled by the federal government, and by the executive. And one of the reasons why is that Congress almost never enacts a check on how the executives use those funds, especially when it's the same party in power. So if the Democrat Congress authorizes spending on X, and there's a Democrat administration, and they spend that money on X plus Y and Z, Congress, it's not like they're going to get thrown in the clink for doing it. We've seen it time and time again.
It sounds to me, Scott, and I'm sure I'm wrong here, but you're saying that everything that they're doing is political.
Well, I mean, hello.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Cheers, Mark.
And that's it for this week's episode of Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guests, Dave Patterson, Jeff Charles, Jim Fight, and the mighty pool of knowledge of all things constitutional, Scott Cosenza, for being part of the team. And as always, I want to thank you, the listeners out there, coast to coast. I'll leave you with one parting thought. When a government and its agencies overstep the boundaries of what is constitutionally permitted to do, it severs the bond, the relationship that puts you, the voter, in charge and makes elected officials your employees. When we ask ourselves why, we should consider the words of James Madison, who said, "The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instrument of tyranny at home." As Joe Biden's foreign policy moves from one blunder to the next, perhaps that's why we see such tyranny being enforced on the home front. But fear not, for remember, you are the boss, and you will have your say when the bill comes due. Until next time, we dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.